land is your land. This land is my land.
The story of the New York City Community Land Initiative, or NYCCLI, began around 2004. Picture the homeless members walking around the city found lots of housing with no people, and they were people without housing. They sought to secure vacant and warehoused property to house homeless people. Through its connections with the Lower East Side's Cooper Square CLT, Picture the Homeless began pushing for community land trusts and for New York City to keep track of vacant property. 6 years later, in May and June 2011, Bloombergville recalled both Hoovervilles and the recent occupation of Tahrir Square. Occupy Wall Street, starting in September, focused attention on Wall Street's predatory practices. By mobilizing members and volunteers, Picture the Homeless had just wrapped up a citywide count of vacant land and housing, finding that the city had room enough to house every homeless person for years. Working with faculty and students at City College, Picture the Homeless started to map out neighborhoods where CLTs would be most needed. In 2012, the New Economy Project, which had a track record of working with neighborhood groups to fight redlining and other predatory financial practices, was working with Columbia faculty and students to plan a community land trust for foreclosed small homes in Queens and Brooklyn. And Community Board 11 in East Harlem had just released a study of risks to rental housing, suggesting community land trusts as a preservation tool. By the summer of 2012, the three projects found each other, and they decided to come together to push the city to embrace community-controlled, non-speculative housing as a key part of a strategy to stabilize neighborhoods and prevent homelessness and displacement. At convenings at the Ford Foundation and in East Harlem in the late fall of 2012 and spring of 2013, the three groups invited others experienced in community-based cooperative and nonprofit housing to join the conversation. In July, this coalition, which had already formed working groups, officially founded and named NYCCLI. Centering the needs of extremely poor New Yorkers, NYCCLI began a pilot project in East Harlem, now the East Harlem El Barrio CLT, to show that today, rather than in the 1980s when it was last done at Cooper Square, CLTs could work both to protect current residents from displacement pressures, loss of equity, and homelessness, and to provide new units that were deeply affordable and appropriate to neighborhood incomes. Over several years of neighborhood outreach, public forums, and the formation of a residence committee, the East Harlem El Barrio CLT was formed. Meetings with city officials with assistance from the Community Board, as well as from a number of neighborhood-based organizations, Banana Kelly, Catch, a developer of mutual housing, UHAB, and the Cooper Square CLT followed, helping the effort spin off as an independent project. The experience of organizing the East Harlem El Barrio CLT especially informed the education and outreach work of NYCCLI as a whole. Homeless and formerly homeless members and staff of Picture the Homeless, alongside students from CUNY, the New School, New Economy Project staff, and others, worked to produce new materials, a video, an informational poster and comic book, and a range of flyers explaining community land trusts in a way accessible and relatable to New York City residents. They also created the board game Trustville. With these in hand, NYCCLI held informational workshops across the city and drew in more organizations to the coalition. During this time as well, NYCCLI's policy work group coordinated the coalition's advocacy on policies that would help CLTs become established and familiar to policymakers, both locally and statewide. These have included work on enabling legislation for CLTs for New York City, advocating for changes in how the city deals with tax delinquent property in order to preserve it as permanently affordable community-controlled housing, as well as supporting Picture the Homeless in passing some of the Housing Not Warehousing Act, which requires the city to count vacant property and landlords to register their vacant buildings. In late 2016, HBD announced a request for expressions of interest in CLTs, and in 2017 chose 9 organizations to participate in a learning exchange, and helped to fund 3 CLTs, the Cooper Square CLT, the Interborough CLT, formed in part by several NYCCLI member groups, and the East Harlem El Barrio CLT. All 12 groups began to meet over the next 2 years in a monthly day-long workshop series, tackling organizational structure, planning, and the importance of base building and organizing for long-term community control. The Learning Exchange ultimately helped NYCCLI grow as a coalition and spurred the participant groups to begin or continue a process of neighborhood base building, property identification, and planning the structure of a dozen locally based CLTs around the city. And there are other groups forming CLTs that were not in the Learning Exchange. Together, we've broadened the conversation beyond housing to comprehensive neighborhood development and community control. Funds from a City Council initiative won by the Coalition for 2020 will support NYCCLI as a coalition to coordinate and support this exciting new work. A new movement for community-controlled social housing has taken shape as part of a larger push for housing justice statewide and nationwide. In New York City, mobilization against rezonings and displacement threats, and victories in the right to counsel are already limiting what landlords can do. The huge statewide wins on rent laws in 2019 are giving tenants new tools to fight predatory landlords and their backers. This year, a Tenant Option to Purchase Act will be a focus of the housing justice movement at the state level, and this could help bring much more property under community control. CLTs are now nationally visible, from the National Homes Guarantee developed by People's Action to progressive candidates' policy platforms. NYCCLI has developed new national-level ties among CLTs working for deep affordability and co-sponsored the Affordable for Whom convening in August that brought groups from around the country around deep affordability and CLTs together. And back in New York City, CLTs are increasingly supported by City Council and now, finally, getting some mayoral attention. NYCCLI has been a moving force in pushing radical approaches to housing onto the agenda. There is far